When we say progressive rock, what are we really talking about? It's quite apparent when you start to explore the meaning of the word progressive, that in the context of rock, it seems to be contradictory. Progressive rock is sometimes called dinosaur rock. You know, they were dinosaurs, weren't they, that made this music, out of touch in a way, representing the old. And then much cooler people came in, punk rockers, new wavers, hip hoppers, and made music that was far more cooler than progressive rock, because progressive rock is somehow conservative. It's rooted in a sort of an elitist view of music history, isn't it? You know, now that seems to contradict the name progressive, doesn't it? What does progressive mean? Does it mean the music is moving forward all the time? Is it very simply just sort of music that progresses from one thing to the other? Or is it music which is exploring new areas, new vistas, new musical landscapes, and maybe new subject matter, new political visions, you know? It's a very difficult term. What is the origin of progressive rock? If you've come to this video expecting me to go through a description of early Pink Floyd and perhaps talk about In the Court of the Crimson King and basically give you a list of albums where there were bands sort of sounding a bit progressive before everybody else and point to that as though that answers anything, all that answers is our need to satisfy our sort of anal retentive wants and put everything into a box. The people who are drawn to progressive rock with all its accurate playing and virtuosity and complex categorization, you know, conceptual continuity, do tend to be the sort of people who like things in boxes. There is a sort of autistic appreciation of art that associates itself with progressive rock music. And that outlook could be well irritated by this video, that I'm not going to categorize and give you a list of the bands that sort of sounded proggy before everybody else. Is there any worth in doing that? Or is it just a way of neatly categorizing everything so we can put everything neatly in its place? And if having everything neatly in its place is what progressive rock is, you know, a display of musicians who know how to play, who can play strong melodies and strong chords and produce music which is good and solid and proper, not all this nonsense we get nowadays, all this rapping and AI and drum machines. You know, and I'm one of those. I champion music played by real people. But is music played by real people that is so accurately played, so put through the mill, so created by computers nowadays? Don't be thinking that modern progressive rock is any more real than any other music around today. In fact, it's less real because it purports to be real musicians playing when really they're playing through the veneer of digital audio manipulation. And now with the advent of AI, are the prog fans going to be happy to listen to new Genesis albums or new King Crimson albums where nobody's played on them? Rick Beato recently covered our first AI #1, top of the country music charts, apparently.
The #1 country song in America is AI generated.
There's a certain ethic, a certain morality associated with progressive rock. Well, we're not going to have it. And yet they will listen to bands that purport to have real musicians on it when actually the drums have been created with a machine, or the guitars have not really been played through a real amp and they've been so edited and quantized that it's a question of how real they are or how not real they are. I mean, this is a whole issue that I had and hit head on when I was working within the progressive rock world. So what is the origin of progressive? What does it represent? What's it coming out to? You know, why were these musicians in the 1960s trying to be progressive? Why did they label it progressive? What were they trying to do? What was the intention of these people in just out of their late teens, early 20s that didn't want to play the music that their generation had played before, but wanted to play music that meant something, meant something to their generation, that had a message which was utopian in outlook. They wanted to build a new world, but they didn't want to build a new world that relied on the old classical music and opera or jazz or any of that. It wanted to create new music for a new youth, you know, who would be able to camp out of Woodstock and show the world the sort of utopia they wanted, you know, where popular music rubbed up against Jimi Hendrix playing the national anthems. Guitar, high volume with feedback and distortion, created strange avant-garde esoteric sounds, accompanying his idea of the salute in America, which was fracturing in the 1960s along generational lines. Western democracies are now fracturing along right and left political lines. The term of progressive now, if you say it to a normal person out in the real world, doesn't, you know, sum up Marillion or Magma or Gentle Giant. It sums up a certain political outlook. Is it the same thing? Are what the progressives want politically the same as what these progressive musicians wanted politically? And my answer would be yes, absolutely. They both wanted to tear down the old societal structure, and they wanted to move forward into a new utopian structure. That's what progressive rock was. It was music that represented that. Can we see that? Well, there is many examples of utopian music making. You know, bands that rather than just sing about love and, you know, driving around in cars, wanted to sing about new worlds that would be better, or fantasy worlds, or dystopian landscapes that sort of echoed what the world was like at that time. It was quite apparent when Jimi Hendrix got up and played Star Spangled Banner at Woodstock that he wasn't just playing a tune he liked, and he wasn't just enjoying the psychedelic aspects of guitar. It was a statement against the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War acted as a backdrop to the origin of progressive rock. One of the origins of progressive rock is the Vietnam War. That is an origin. But how many people coming up on the internet now with an audience of progressive rock fans are going to cite the Vietnam War as an origin of progressive rock? But it probably plays a much greater influence than, say, some track that The Nice put out in 1967. Why was Keith Emerson, you know, jumping all over his keyboards and stabbing it? What was he trying to do? What was he representing? He was representing the same thing that Jim Morrison was representing, the same thing that Jimi Hendrix was representing. These were young people showing their will to be. It wasn't destructive, it was joyous, but it was joyous in that they were going to tear down society and build a new utopian society. ELP debuted in 1970 at the Isle of Wight Festival. These music festivals had just sort of emerged, you know, out of nowhere. You know, we probably in the 1967 Monterey. Before that, music festivals were quite civilized affairs. You know, if you went to the sort of Monterey Jazz Festival, you know, and you would sit on deck chairs and listen to Duke Ellington gently playing in the sun while, you know, eating strawberries and drinking wine. But the Isle of Wight, for people I know who were there, said it was quite bestial to be there, to see what was going on in the audience. It was chaotic and bestial. It was at once a sort of pastoral utopia and a sort of hell on earth at the same time.
So Andy Edwards has asked me to do a brief talk about the Isle of Wight Festival when my brother's band, Emerson, Lake and Palmer, it was their second gig, but their first real big gig. A long time ago. I think I was not quite 15 when I went. Actually, the backup story is we drove down in an old van, no seatbelt rules in those days. I think it was with Glenn Tipton, later to be in Judas Priest, but it was just local friends, guitarists, drove down to the Isle of Wight with just a sleeping bag. There were different days, festivals then. We all went primarily actually with Hendrix, because we'd not seen Jimi Hendrix, so we wanted to see him. So we all jumped in an old van and drove down. I was just a member of the audience until 10 years after we were on, just before Emerson, Lake and Palmer next. And I convinced the security, yeah, I'm his brother, I want to go up on stage. And walk around the back, past Roger Daltrey and all that, The Who, getting ready for their set. Carl was talking to the drummer from 10 years after and said, oh yeah, made it, great. For me, Carl was just 20. It was an amazing set. And I'm sort of just about bobbing up. My head is in the video of it, trying to get to see this new band, brand new band. So it's very exciting. I'd seen The Nice with Keith Emerson, and later on would go on to play with David O'List, the original guitarist from The Nice. But this was really exciting. Keith Emerson was the man, and Greg Lake from 21st Century Schizoid Man singing. It was like, wow, this is something special. And they had two giant cannons on the stage, which at the end of the set went off. And whoa, I think we all jumped out of our skin, particularly those of us so close on stage. I was getting in the way of a photographer who was trying to get the first good pictures of ELP, Emerson, Lake and Palmer. And I'll actually attach my favourite photo of Carl that photographer who sort of kept muscling in took. And he took a great photos, Carl, on his Gretsch, silver Gretsch drum kit, which he'd used in Atomic Rooster previously, with the metal Gretsch snare drum, which he passed on to me, which I later passed on to Ian Palmer, another drummer in the family. So the set was just, Carl was just so concentrated and on it, extremely confident at 20. I think Andy had said somewhere the first album came out fully formed. And that was my feeling too. I know John Peel said they were a waste of time, talent and electricity. But for me, no, there was something special. And
the Hells Angels thinking that the whole world could live together and get on, and the Hells Angels ended up stabbing some kid to death in front of the audience. The dream was over. Progressive rock, the sophistication that had been etched out by bands like King Crimson and Pink Floyd, and yes, Genesis, was actually painting music where the utopian ideals of the 1960s had already come crashing down. There is a confusion, there is a feeling of things winding down, of changing, of heading to a much more dystopian and nihilist utopia, if a utopia could be described in that way. When Tony Williams' Lifetime made their second album, which was called Turn It Over, they wished to turn over to society. They had terrible lyrics and terrible vocals in there, sort of egged on by the sort of democratization of the pop song by Bob Dylan. Tony Williams felt he could just sit there playing their incredibly heavy, extreme electric jazz, whilst trudging on about new worlds and new places, and why don't they just all go off and have free sex and worry about the Vietnam War at the same time, And it seems trite to us. This idea that you're going to turn over society and make a new society is actually replaced very quickly by the mid-70s, that the society that we're going to turn over is going to be a terrible place. It is going to be absolutely nihilist, and there is no point. There is no future, as the Sex Pistols shouted out. No future. Surely progressive, the term progressive implies a future, a better future. There was a beautiful naivety in the idea of progressive rock, that popular music could change society. It could change people. And I think in some cases it did. It achieved its goal. It didn't fail. But then society moved on. And the idea of changing people, the idea of the spiritual, the metaphysical, the idea of the English aesthetic, all these things that emerge in the progressive rock genre, either transmute or get thrown out. What are the origins of progressive rock? The second half of the 20th century grows directly out of the outcome of the Second World War. The Second World War could be seen as the finishing off of the First World War. The beginning of the 20th century starts off with this sort of tumultuous, anarchic politics, which is very similar to what we have now. Anarchists were running around blowing people up and shooting people. You know, they were trying to enact something. What was it? We don't know. None of these sort of communists and Nazi utopias hadn't been envisaged then. It was anarchy. People wanted to tear it down. You know, they wanted to tear it down in much the same way as they want now. And this whipped up all sorts of frenzies. It whipped up, you know, old countries that are there for a long time to go up against countries that had just been invented. And the ideology that comes from Hegel, this ideology of the zeitgeist, of epochs, of changing, you know, of the age of Aquarius, all these ideas, or the Third Reich, or the great Soviet Union, or the great Maoist, you know, communist utopia. The first half of our century is that, and it's that unadulterated. And in 1945, we wake up from a hell and go to ourselves, what happened? Where did this utopian thinking get us? The Nazis were wrong. Their utopia was wrong. The Soviet Union had closed down, and you know, the communists in the West were becoming aware of the atrocities that Stalin was enacting on his people. There was a want to go to another type of utopia, which was one of a borderless world where we all hold hands and walk around in a circle. You know, the United Nations, the unification of Europe, all of these things are a different utopian ideal. No racism, no sexism, let everybody come forth, let everybody have their say. What have they got to say? And with that ideal, once that started to happen, motivated by the idea that we were going, how could 6 million Jews be gassed in gas chambers in a Western democracy? How could it happen? Because people's voices weren't allowed to come forth. The books that were being burned by the Nazis in the 30s were not, you know, Western democratic books. They were the thoughts of Jewish postmodernist philosophers. A lot of them ran to America, and they set up their postmodernist schools in America, and that became the new way of seeing the world. Hip and trendy people were existentialists, and you can see this when you watch The Rebel, which was made in 1960, a very English take on progressiveness. And at one point, Tony Hancock goes to a very progressive party, and he meets the existentialist, very strange people. He reacts to it in a very English way, doesn't he, old Tony Hancock in The Rebel? 1960, he's on the cusp of a new way of seeing things. The postmodernists are in their universities. They're talking to the youth. They're talking to the people who are going to be the artists, the painters, and the musicians. And they're going to say, we need a new world order. We need to throw this one out. The elites created all this. The generation before created all these problems. You don't want to go into that. You don't want to be running up the beach, do you? On D-Day, getting shot down. You don't want to be carted off to concentration camps or be saluting a swastika. We need a new world. We need to listen to these people. We need to listen to those with different voices. We need to listen to black people. You know, they've been knocked down too. Women have been knocked down. Gay people have been pushed into the crevices of society, scurrying around being guilty about their sexuality, but they shouldn't be. We should let it all hang out. A new generation emerged, and they were forged in this way of thinking that was going to avoid the First and the Second World War. It was going to build something else. There's no coincidence that bands like Pink Floyd and The Who explored fully the idea of being born in the war years and explored what their parents had gone through. And now this generation were not going to be pulled into the same thing. They were going to live a different life, especially the educated middle classes. They were going to university, exploring these ideas. Many of them, they were doing the arts. They were reading, you know, Kerouac, they were reading Allen Ginsberg. There was another way of seeing the world. You know, Jack Kerouac going out on his voyages like a 20th century Odysseus out having these adventures. It influences that generation. Aldous Huxley's experiments with LSD. Can we see the world in a different way? Can we actually transform ourselves? Can we transform consciousness? Do drugs open up a higher reality? What about Eastern philosophies? How do we not end up falling into the trap of our parents? We don't want to dress like them. We don't want to have the jobs like them. What they're doing is pointless. Can I not see it's pointless? I feel that rock and roll is built upon, especially progressive rock, is built upon the outlook probably best illustrated by Monty Python with their sketch on the Ministry of Silly Walks, which in this sketch we see a middle-class man going out to fulfill a middle-class life. He wears a black suit and a bowler hat. He has a case under his arm and an umbrella. He is being bred to join the factory of the middle class in England. The film The Rebel lampooned exactly the same thing. You know, these robots going to work, having to ride the train at the same time, sitting on the same train, doing the same thing every day, clocking into some sort of Henry Ford office where they did the same repetitive action to churn out this stuff. In the Monty Python film, these graduates of Cambridge, the top of their class, the new elite, are questioning it. As he walks out the door and he walks down the road, you can see another queue for another set of people in cloth caps and old, brown jackets. Those are the working class. They have a different path. When he arrives at the Ministry of Silly Walks, he sits down and somebody comes in who does not have the posh accent and tries to show them his silly walk. And it's not the right walk. This is not just random stuff. It's a very exact critique of the class system in the United Kingdom and how these middle-class white gentlemen who had gone through the university system, studied maybe arts or the classics, they could see this. The irony of the origins of progressive rock is it's a very English phenomenon. It is the English middle class, high elite middle class, turning against their destiny and grabbing onto whether it be the sort of psychedelic utopia of LSD, people like David Allen, who had come out of that sort of whole beat poetry world. Maybe it was that. Or maybe it was the sort of Marxism that you were going to see embraced by the likes of Robert Wyatt or Henry Cow. Maybe the poshies like Pink Floyd, Roger Waters was also going to embrace a very leftist view, and he was going to turn George Orwell on his head and hit the elites with that imagery. So the pigs in Animal Farm, which represent the communists, suddenly becomes the pigs at the trough of capitalism. It's left-wing propaganda. What about Genesis, those lads that went to Charterhouse, privately schooled? They were going to take the idea of, English history through the vision of Greek mythology. That sort of thing that Stephen Fry loves so much. Stephen Fry would not have gone into comedy if he'd have been a few more years older. He would have been probably playing in a progressive rock band like Genesis. So Genesis takes that American rock and roll idea of freedom and it turns it on its head, culminating with The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway. A very American character going out and graffitiing walls, but going through sort of another odyssey that is like a sort of parallel rock and roll mythology, where the individual stands up against the gods. This is the Apollonian, Dionysian, utopian dream. It's the dream of Aquarius. This is known to the elite middle classes. Progressive rock is a very strong push against the system, but it's coming in that first wave of rock and roll where the people who are able to say that are the middle class elites. Every single progressive rock band comes out of that. Now, that's not to say that we don't have working class people in there. And it's very interesting the way the working class people are. Steve Hackett in Genesis acts as the sort of yin to that yang. John Anderson is not a poshie at all. John Anderson has a completely different vision of a utopia. which I believe is forged in a much more working class view. But of course, the Rick Wakemans and the Steve Howes in there are, you know, they've come from middle class. I recognise middle class. I think we all can do. So the origins of progressive rock are English. They're in the English aesthetic. They're in our absurdist poetry. They're in the idea of the metaphorical meanings within Shakespeare. It's in the sort of academic teaching of Greek mythology that came through our art system. It's in our music, especially the pastoral music of the late Romantic composers like Elgar and Holst and Delius and Ray Vaughan Williams. That aesthetic is in there. There is also the grandiosity of classical music as a form, right? Progressive rock is interesting is that it challenges the system. It tries to tear it down, but it tears it down with techniques that are very aligned to that system. It tries to turn it on its head. And it's a marriage between the democratization of American black music through Lonnie Donegan, through the idea of skiffle. Anybody can get up. That's the punk that ignites progressive rock. But these people, probably because in the United Kingdom, to play rock and roll, you had to be able to access it. The Beatles could access it because they lived in a port city and those records were coming in. But for people I know that were a generation above me, it was really hard to even hear Chuck Berry or Little Richard. There would be snatches on the radio, but there was no radio station for these people. But these people had to grasp at it, and to get an electric guitar and an amplifier meant that you had to be really secure. You know, the Beatles were incredible in pushing a working class aspect into rock and roll. Because of skiffle, they come directly out of skiffle. The Stones were much more middle class. Jeff Beck, Jimmy Page, much more middle class. There is a schism in the music that's coming out of the 60s, which is sort of working at the time. In the 1960s, we've got a mix of these different classes, but it does pan out, and a lot of the visionary aspects of progressive rock are coming out of a very elitist upper middle class view, allied to a sort of Marxist, left-wing, postmodernist view of the world. Bands like The Who are coming in with a working class aspect there. It is in there. We see the emergence in the UK of a much more sort of deeper rock and roll aesthetic with bands like the Small Faces and the Faces. And those things are mixing all together without a doubt. I think some of the more heavier bands have a different aspect. There's progressiveness in there, but it's allied to something else. I think the best example of that would be Black Sabbath. Black Sabbath should be a progressive rock band, but there's a clunkiness and a naivety, which the elites sort of look down sniffily, but which registered with the much bigger part of the audience who want progressive ideas, but want them shot through something that they can understand. They don't really want the sort of Charterhouse view of Greek mythology passed through Genesis and songs about Lamia. They want something that looks like a Hammer horror film. They get it. There is a thread that runs through progressiveness that survives it. It runs into Judas Priest, and it runs through to the new wave of British heavy metal, Diamond Head and Iron Maiden. That progressiveness runs through, but it is being grasped by the working classes, and the working classes that are turning against the elitism of a sort of NME version of what rock and roll should be by the late 70s, which has thrown progressive rock out. I was always attracted to progressive rock as a youngster because it rocked. Yes, Genesis, King Crimson, it rocked. But this nihilist aspect that we see emerge in the 1970s, I believe is first spotted amongst the proggers by Robert Fripp in King Crimson. And by 1972 and 1973, he takes on that aspect that Black Sabbath had brought into the music, and he brings in a much more darker, heavier aspect of progressive rock on Lark's Tongues and aspect on Stars of the Violet, Black and Red. This influenced progressive rock and progressive metal, and so many dark bands like Tool and Soundgarden and Nirvana have their roots in that sound that Robert Fripp pioneered. The very pretty and ornate nonsense that we hear on In the Court of the Crimson King, I've always doubted. I have never bought into Cadence and Cascade, you know, some middle-class song about two groupies, you know, cast as some sort of nymphs from Greek mythology. I've never bought into it. The thing that was great about In the Court of the Crimson Kings is that King Crimson had nailed this sort of dystopian heaviness on 21st century schizoid man. A truly progressive song that painted a picture of a sort of, you know, Leonardo da Vinci Aquarian man in the future who's schizoid, almost like a robot, almost like the original Gollum, you know, like the Iron Man. Right, these ideas are incredibly powerful in rock and roll, and they survive, and they go through progressive rock. And when progressive rock is sort of, you know, cast aside by the commerciality of disco and by the visceral working class angst shout of no future of the punk rockers, there's something in punk's DNA, and it is this nihilism, and that nihilism is always there. It's always been there. It starts off as almost like an absurdism in the sort of Edward Lear aspect of the Beatles, you know, the Alice in Wonderland absurdism, which is deep down in the English aesthetic. The idea that there are naughty elements out in the forest, you know, not like evil demons, but just naughty spirits. They're going to cause trouble, almost like gremlins, you know, and they're going to cause trouble. And they're there. They're there all the way through, right in the early days. You know, these new Aquarian rockers like the Beatles and Pink Floyd and Syd Barrett and all of them cast themselves as sort of impish. They're pan-like. You know, it's all very Midsummer Night's Dream. Right? Puck coming out, causing trouble, is not, Syd Barrett is not Ian Anderson in Jethro Tull, is not John Lydon, Johnny Rotten in the Sex Pistols. Is he not just Puck? Is he not part Puck and part a Nietzschean Zarathustra coming down from the mountain, and a madman who is in their rantings identifying something profound? Is that not the origins of progressive rock? Is not the origins of progressive rock a new generation that were brought up in the shadow of the Second World War and in the shadow of the generations before, quite conscious decisions of how that could be avoided? Okay, and that generation grew up in it, and they turned around and they answered their parents. They say, "I love you, parents, but you need to go." Jim Morrison literally kills his parents on The End. The original Dystopia, the original progressive rock track, that was recorded in 1966, came out early 1967. The End is the origin of progressive rock. Frank Zappa's Nihilist Mothers, which turned on the hippie project, is the beginning of progressive rock. The nihilism that we hear in punk is in progressive rock right from the start. And the British and the English slip it through by acting like silly little foresty beings, you know, that are pulling at everything, naughty little elves, the naughty elves that are going to make it seem so absurd. It's no coincidence that the Monty Python types joined forces with the rock and roll types. We could see the rock and roll funded Monty Python, The Holy Grail, as being the great progressive rock film. Everything that's great about that film is in the progressive rock project. It's like a Gong album or a Pink Floyd album or a Jethro Tull album coming to life. It's like a Genesis album coming to life. Monty Python nailed it. The proggers were never able to quite get into the media and portray aesthetically what they were truly about. All we were left up with is incredible albums that utilised the technology of the recording studio and pushed the subject matter of prog to the absolute limit. We look at that, and one section of contemporary society looks at the abilities of these sort of elitist middle-class gentlemen with their knowledge of mythology and history and their virtuoso classical training. And they do sit open-mouthed with awe of what was achieved in the realm of rock and roll. But by the same token, they don't like it. They don't like it because they see the privilege. And so these musicians are cast aside. Rick Wakeman is fine to be a genius when he's coming up to for the piano part for Life on Mars by David Bowie, because David Bowie never succumbed to that sort of virtuosity. It's there actually on his third album. It's very heavy, almost like Black Sabbath, and it's very proggy. But out of that, he forges another idea, the idea of art rock, and this survives more. But the intentions are the same. So Rick Wakeman is lauded for his incredible, contribution to Life on Mars, which is such an incredible piece of songwriting, but is made even greater by the huge architectural musical approach that Rick Wakeman brings to it. That creates something that goes beyond rock and roll, which has a yearning and it has an emotional center which is as advanced as any classical music. Rick Wakeman has been able to survive by being that naughty forest imp, by being a curmudgeon at one point, a grumpy old man, or a silly man with people riding around on horses. But Rick Wakeman is serious, and he's serious about his music, and his music has always been serious. And what he has done to rock and roll is incredibly profound, but we will never think that, will we? We will never think that. Because Rick Wakeman plays a part. That aspect of progressive rock was allowed to survive. When progressive rock was being looked down on through the 80s and 90s, its re-emergence came out of a sort of postmodernist media going, ELP, they were terrible, but they were funny, weren't they? And there was an entertainment. He was a band who was like doing these huge gigs with full orchestras, and Carl Parton's got no shirt on and he's ringing a bell with his chain, on a chain, and Greg Lake sat on his £10,000 carpet, and Keith Emerson's in front of all these wires, and he's stabbing his keyboard and these tunes like Carnival 9, welcome back my friends to the show that never ends, this idea of this dystopian future. Exactly the same subject matter that Joni Mitchell in what song is it? Oh no, it seems to know, we don't know what it's got to be good. What's that? Whatever that song is, that's not Big Yellow Taxi. What's that one called? Anyway, that tune by Joni Mitchell, in one song explores exactly the same thing that Carnival 9 does, but the critics can't admit it. This is dystopian futures played out. Progressive rock did it brilliantly. It's what links what they're doing to punk. And one of the most sort of darkest, one of the most sort of dystopian bands of all the progressive rock world, one that I find difficult to get because it's so dark, is Van der Graaf Generator. Peter Hamill, like Robert Fripp, sees the limits of progressive rock. And by 1974, he's forging ideas on his solo albums that are really going to delineate punk. Punk in the United Kingdom takes that sort of artsy-fartsy, visceral rock and roll attitude of the Ramones and Patti Smith, but it links it with all this stuff, this dystopian, English aesthetic, homemade aspect of progressive rock. And it takes a pinch of, glam rock, the old Bay City Rollers and Sweet, and dare I say Gary Glitter, mixes all that in with a bit of progginess, a bit of David Bowie, and before you know it, you've got something which can be seen, if you really open your eyes, as the logical working class outpouring of progressive rock. Now, the punks did it, and they did it well. but they did not do it as well as the metalers, the true working class music that was sophisticated, that could explore these ideas, but not get bogged down by the sort of pretentiousness that the middle class English added into progressive rock, which those elitists, those enemy elitists can sniff from a mile away. Now, they hated Black Sabbath. They just hated Black Sabbath because they were common. They found Ozzy silly. This is really evinced in Roger Waters' cruel assessment of the legacy of Ozzy Osbourne just after he died last year. Absolutely cruel. A very middle-class, left-wing, millionaire looking down his nose at what Ozzy created because he's out of touch with how the normal people, the normal working classes who he wants to save with his sort of leftist utopia, really see the world. They're not interested in that. They just would rather sit down and listen to The Number of the Beast by Iron Maiden and explore all that nonsense, be frightened by a sort of Hollywood idea of what's scary. But within that, punch the air, and kick the things out and be unified by something which they know the establishment look down their noses at. Of course, now that they've been going for 50 years, Iron Maiden, and sold millions and millions of albums and cannot be argued with, they give them some sort of grudging respect. The origins of prog is something which is unacceptable to the establishment, and it always was. And that disdain that the establishment has for progressive rock is there right from the beginning. It is a generation that said, no, we're not conforming. We are not going to fall into those traps again. We want to build a new sort of world. And in trying to build that world, it then saw the limits of that world. And it pushed. What John Anderson's trying to do on Tales from Topographic Oceans is utilize his position in one of the biggest rock bands in the world, but not only one of the biggest rock bands, but a rock band which is able to have a number one with music which is really stressing and stretching the limitations of the audience. He believed that he could put some sort of Eastern philosophy into the West. John McLaughlin did exactly the same thing with the Mavish Orchestra. They were trying to change the world, not through some 1960s utopian hippie ideal, but they were hippies, but they wanted to free people spiritually. Pink Floyd, Dark Side of the Moon, is postmodern existentialism mixed with a sort of left-wing view of the world. And it's in perfect aesthetic balance on Dark Side of the Moon. It challenges this idea of this 1950s future where everything's going to be wonderful. And it asks these early guys in these early 20s are able to transport themselves into an almost like middle-age view, the middle-age view of the second half of the 20th century, and go, what is the point of all this? The same question asked brilliantly by David Byrne in Talking Heads, Once in a Lifetime. What's the meaning of this? What's this all about? That's the dystopian aesthetic of punk, and it's the dystopian aesthetic in Black Sabbath and heavy metal. I could go through every single progressive rock band at that time, and you can see it's not just about odd time signatures. It's not just about tracks that go on for 20 minutes. Jethro Tull with his Aqualung character, or the passion play that he plays out on that album, or the sort of critique of prog and the critique of the media that he makes on Thick as a Brick. Progressive rock is a political, social form of music, and it is truly, at the time it was made, it was truly progressive. It wasn't progressive because it was trying to rewrite rock and roll. It was progressive in that it was questioning and exploring the idea of what the future is going to be. It was not conservative. It was willing to rip up what had gone before. But what do we put in that place? And the progressive rock bands just didn't fall into the sort of all you need is love of the Beatles, That was over. When 1970 comes on, which is when prog really starts, and I would class prog starting with the release of ELP's first album, which is an absolute masterpiece and seems to combine everything that Yes are going to do, Pink Floyd are going to do, King Crimson are going to do, and even Van de Graaff Generator. There's a darkness on the first ELP album, which I find incredibly compelling. There's a rawness, there's a punkiness to it, but also an incredibly sophisticated sound. No guitars. It works away from that American rock and roll rhythm and blues electric guitar aesthetic. This is keyboards. This is an organ. It should sound like it's a bloody in a church. Keith Emerson's, what he did with the Hammond organ, and then what he did with the synthesizer. This is groundbreaking stuff. This video is more about me championing why I think progressive rock is so great. And my central thesis here is that idea that we cannot repeat the Second World War again. We need to create a new future, and how that utopian ideal came crashing down. It starts with the assassination of Kennedy. It is finished with the assassination of his little brother and Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. Right, it falls apart. We go into the 70s. The 70s are dark and dystopian, and the first part of the 70s, the progressive rock etch out this sort of almost like nihilist dystopian view of the future, utilizing conservative tropes from, English history, from philosophy, from classical music, from opera, from mythology. It's a brilliant technique to create new symphonies, new rock and roll symphonies made by young people with electric instruments that question the future. And almost like create a new classical music for a new generation. The proggers understand the limits of it by 1973-74. And they lay the groundwork. And I believe that punk, unlike disco, which is truly the anathema to prog, punk is the natural extension. And once punk has re-engaged progressive rock, we see, bands like, The Damned. We see bands like the Stranglers and then New Order. Then we see The Cure, and we see other pop bands like XTC emerging. Then later on, Talk. We see Cardiacs emerging. And through the 1980s, the great music that exists in the early 80s is entirely rooted in progressive rock. The thing that progressive rock laid down is not trusted by the establishments. The establishment came in and they could deal with punk, they could deal with new wave, they could point to that and go, isn't that wonderful? And in that, they took the power away from it. Now, of course, by the time we get to the 1980s here in the United Kingdom, a certain disaffected generation that were not the progressive rock generation that had come up through punk, and they had been experienced the sort of visceral, we could do whatever we want aspect of punk, and also the we can do whatever we want aspect of new wave of British heavy metal. If you take the new wave of British heavy metal, you take punk, a certain element emerges in the United Kingdom here, and it's the neo-proggers. And the neo-proggers at once released the punk aspects of prog. Early Marillion and IQ and Pendragon are all very punky. It's all very edgy. It's all very do-it-yourself. IQ was like Genesis on speed. Everything was played at 100 miles an hour. I know, because I used to play in that band, and when we got to those early songs, I could feel my right hand cramping up in much the same way as all those punk drummers did in the mid 70s when they're going to go, and their hands like doing all that. But by the same token, their return and to push against the norms out there in the 1980s, or the Duran Durans and Tears for Fears of the world, which were also rooted in progressive rock, so much so, but their turning against that made prog suddenly conservative. The neo-proggers were a bit like the trad jazzers in the 1940s. And a conservatism grows in, and now progressive rock does not mean these young sort of Dionysian type, early 20s guys that have been educated at private school coming out and trying to tear the system by making this mad progressive music utilizing electronics and virtuosity and classical instrumentation and arrangement, to paint some sort of dystopian mythological landscape. right? They're doing that, but they're doing that because it's the genre. And certain things start to creep in. Neo-prog, and I played in it, but I believe neo-prog turns prog, and it starts to then emerge, and the influence is then heard in heavy metal, which turns into progressive metal, and then you get the likes of Dream Theater and bands like that, and they start to look back and they start to celebrate, this early progressive rock in itself. They forget about the meaning. The meaning is lost in just the sort of religious intention of just doing the same thing over and over again. And without these bands who are now aging and disappearing and splitting up, bands come and fulfill their place. If you are a massive Pink Floyd band, don't worry, there's 1,000 neo-prog bands that sound exactly like Pink Floyd. With all the nasty bits taken out, they're never going to do anything like, Ummagumma. Don't worry, they'll never do that. It will just be the beautiful two chords soaring past, maybe a song that's a little bit dystopian, but maybe it's criticising the First World War rather than criticising the contemporary climate. And in the midst of that will be a very beautiful Dave Gilmour guitar solo, which the fans could go to festivals and watch these bands and listen to that guitar solo without feeling that they need to be young and wanting to tear the system down. And with that becomes the great dichotomy, the great contradiction of modern progressive rock. Progressive rock means conservative rock, but progressive rock also means something that is so unpalatable, but that the metropolitan elites, those guys that ended up as journalists at the NME, cannot deal with. Both of those are in prog, and now we have someone like me, late middle age, I've got a YouTube channel, and here I am, brought up in a time where I want to kick against the system, but I'm an old bloke. So you get this weird thing about this old bloke kicking against the system on a YouTube channel, trying to be edgy, trying to use humour, trying to be the imp, the naughty imp. I am the naughty imp. I am progressive rock. I've moved from playing progressive rock to having a progressive YouTube channel. This is this is like Gong, this is like Cardiacs, this is like Frank Zappa. This is what this channel is, right? And if you want to know why I do it, it's because of that. I carry on in the spirit, but I'm an old bloke. But I'm still going to do it because I can't think of anything else to do. Our generation is like that. Our generation has in our DNA the sort of wackiness and impishness of English progressive rock combined with a punk attitude. There's a punk attitude here as well. And we look at the system and go, we're not really going to tolerate that, are we? The origins of progressive rock need to be focused on. We need to consider what they were, right? There is a value in young middle-class English gentlemen pushing against the system because it shows that now old middle-class English gentlemen on YouTube, maybe we could still push against the system, and maybe we don't have to go, right, we're invalid now. This new identity politic that came in, which has said that, our viewpoints aren't valued, our worldview is not valued, we're automatically privileged even if we're skint, that we should not be listened to, right? And when I did this YouTube channel, I realized that people enjoyed me coming on and ranting. I come on here and rant like a little imp in the forest. I'm causing trouble. Every time I come in here all sort of wide-eyed and unknowing and start to say stuff that is going to upset a certain section of society, that the same thing that finds ELP and Yes and Genesis a bit distasteful, that thing that's been there the whole of your life, that you haven't been able to celebrate your bands you like because the establishment think it's nonsense, pretentious, overblown rubbish, that silly people like, right? This video is about the fact that is prog's great strength. And in that, not only did it create an esoteric heart that went through punk, went into popular music, it went through the whole of rock and roll. And this is why a lot of avant-garde bands that were pushing against the envelope throughout the rock and roll project when it was alive, have a foot in the progressive rock world. And it is not The critics and the establishment elite who write the narrative of rock and roll do not want to give it its due. Genesis, Pink Floyd, Yes, King Crimson, Magma, Can, Faust, all these bands, Van de Graaff Generator, Jethro Tull, Gong, you know, all of them are a summit of achievement in the rock and roll project, an absolute summit. As great, if not greater, than your Joy Divisions and your Velvet Undergrounds and your Van Morrisons and all these bands that I only take a mickey out of them because I know the critical leaks can't take it, because they have been pushing that this is the best of all. You know, that London Calling is the great progressive rock album, and it is. It's an attempt at the Clash to make a sort of working class left wing progressive album out of visceral rock and roll. But it had been done before, and it had been done better. And 21st Century Schizoid Band does it in a way that the Clash couldn't even dream of doing it. But we're not allowed to say that. But the truth is, that origin that's in progressive rock, when you go back and listen to that first Pink Floyd album, or 21st Century Schizoid Band, or that first ELP album, or the Yes album, all these things, if you go back to them, that thing that chimed with us when we were young, and it chimed with me when I was in the middle of the 1980s, and I knew that what was chiming in with was challenging the zeitgeist that I was in the 1980s, right? I knew it was. And like in new wave of British heavy metal, then like progressive rock, was a badge I wore that put me as other compared to my own generation. You know, and it chimed. I was in 1982 at 14 years old, put on The Young Ones, and Neil was there, you know, this relic from beforehand, you know, and he would bust into his hippie friend's house and kick the record player at one point, and realised, as he was trying to be all totalitarian, which wasn't in his makeup, that he'd kick the album, and as he looked down at the album that playing, he went, "Oh no, Steve Hillage." And I went, "Who's this hippie?" I checked out Steve Hillage because of that reference in The Young Ones in 1982. I'm telling you, it's true. That gene, that sort of speck of DNA is in our generation now, right? And we don't need to shut up. Right, it isn't just the young that should have a say. We can have a say too, and our opinion is valid, right? And I know that this video has tried to draw together my political stance, my love of progressive rock and jazz rock fusion, but the early chaotic stuff, which is a challenge to the system, like the Mavish Structure, Tony Williams' Lifetime, and all that stuff, right? And that's an American version of it. Let's not go there on this video. That is also allied with a certain impish troublemaking that I want to put forth here. I sit here as a mixture of rail, I'm being ever so bloody pretentious here, but who cares? That is in my genes. I'm going to be pretentious. I am like grumpy old Aqualung. I am like rail. You know, that is what I am like. You know, I am like these protagonists that were put forth, you know, by the progressive rockers, and I'm going to come in here and cause trouble. And I promise you, I will always be doing that. And you might expect a serious video about serious stuff like this, one where we really explore the history of rock and roll and how that relates to our culture and why it's important. Here I am, you know, look at the lighting here. I've created this space there that I am at once talking, but also painting out a sort of picture of stuff. There's stuff going on here the whole time. And I did that deliberately. I really wanted to come and tell a tale. I really wanted to come and tell a story here of the late 20th century, how it affected my generation, and how now, even at the age of 57, and I know some of you are like 60, 70, maybe 80, we are still allowed to be impished and silly. And it's a way in which us old folks can bring the system down, or at least question the system. That is the origin of prog. That was what went through all of prog. That's what the neo-proggers were doing. And even when you listen to the most conservative, you know, prog, the what we can call prog, which isn't progressive in any shape or form, you know, even when we listen to one of those bands, it's still in the DNA. They might be reenacting it like some sort of religious ceremony. You know, it might be some prog metal band doing yet another dystopian landscape, which is sort of tells a sort of conceptual story of some sort of Terminator type you know, and they just think it's cool because they grew up, you know, reading comics and all that type of stuff. But in that dystopian story is still this idea of how do we negotiate our future? How do we go into the future? And how can people of our age, whose futures are probably a little bit less than the young people's futures, as we look to the future, is there anything we can pass on to them that might help them? You know, what we can pass on to them is to say, your future is hopeful, but nihilist at the same time. Both of those things exist. In other words, it's a blank canvas, and the young people can make it whatever they want to make it. But to do that, they may have to tear it all up and turn it over and turn it down and turn it up and do all those things. They might have to scream, no future, no future for you. They might have to scream that at each other. They may have to take on the dark forces of chaos and enter the belly of the beast, which is a very dangerous thing to do, which is a lot safer to do it within the realm of music. You know, so I get to the end of this video, this Philosophy Sunday video. Hope you enjoyed it. The origins of progressive rock, not what you wanted, but maybe what you needed. So with this sort of arrogant, you know, self-belief that I am doing something wonderful here, but also with that sort of very English, just put myself down so you can never accuse me of doing that. And now that knowing sort of postmodernist comment, which means I know that that's the case, which brings me right back to the beginning, and I'm all still another clever clogs again. But now I've called myself a clever clogs. Now I've been able to push myself down. What is that's going on? That's at the heart of progressive rock. That I just did there is at the heart of it. And with that, I bid you adieu. So, adieu. You know. A Jew is someone who lives in Israel. A Dieu is something French. It's a French word for like goodbye. But I'm being a bit pretentious, which is what I do, because I've got prog in my DNA. And so have you, if you're watching this channel. Well, at least I hope you have. And if you haven't, I will bless you with the spirit of prog and hope it sits with you and helps you to negotiate your future, which of course is your future. Hopefully, if they'll let it be. Please put a like on it, subscribe. I have a Patreon. You can become a free member or you can become a paid up member. I also have a membership here and all that, like that stuff. You know, you can put some money in my PayPal tip jar. Thanks for watching this video. And I will see you on the next video. Namaste.